Hey guys, and thank you for joining us today for Cyber Talk with me, Julia Lee, Senior Manager of the Education and Center of Excellence Unit here within the Cybersecurity Division of the Ontario Public Service. We have a very exciting episode lined up for you today, and one of the hottest topics right now is artificial intelligence or AI and all the opportunities that it can bring to cybersecurity. Are you prioritizing identity access management? How is IAM transforming security for businesses? And we have a goal in place today. And by the end of this episode, you'll be going away with an understanding of how AI is really shaping the future of access management and the importance of really addressing challenges, risks, and vulnerabilities. But before we get into it, I'd love to introduce our special guest for today. I'm super excited to introduce to you Mike Gillan. Mike is the co-founder and CTO of BlokSec Technologies, where they provide decentralized identity service for organizations, providing a true passwordless authentication and consent-based authorization services. Mike built his career in identity and access management in, I think, over 20 years. I think he is an expert at this point, a really key pillar of cybersecurity, and is a perfect person to have on today to talk about this. Mike, welcome to the Cyber Talk Show.
Awesome. Thank you, Julia. Thanks for that nice intro. I know when you talk about BlokSec and all the things that we're trying to cram into what we do, it can be a real mouthful. So you did a great job at that. Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here. Your show is awesome. I love the comfortable conversational style. So looking forward to our chat today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about IAM and just picking your brain. I've definitely got an array of questions here and some questions that's teed up by our audience today. But just before we jump into the questions, Mike, I wanted to define IAM for our viewers who may not be familiar with it, or Identity and Access Management, or IAM for short, is a set of processes, policies, and technologies that really help manage the roles and access levels of individual network entities. In other words, IAM ensures that the right people and job roles in your organization can really access the right tools they need for their jobs and that no one else has that access. I don't know if I did that description justice, but with that being said there, Mike, I'll pass it to you if there is a way in terms of, you probably get this question of what is IAM?
Well, yeah, you nailed it with that. I think my go-to when I talk about what is IAM is that I talk about the 5 rights, which is really what you were just talking about, that the right people or the right things have the right access to the right resources at the right time. So I know that's a lot of rights, but it's with an R, not with a, so when we break that down a little bit, if we start with the right people or the right things, that's really where we're talking about identity. So identity is who is the person or the thing on the other end of the network that is interacting with my service, interacting with my application. And that might seem plainly obvious, but actually it's a very difficult problem to solve in computing. There's a famous New Yorker cartoon where there are 2 dogs with one sitting in front of the computer. And he turns to his friend dog and he says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog because you really were hidden behind the computer screen. So having a way to really tell who that person is, to really identify that person, it's not easy to do. That's called authentication. And then next we talk about the right access to the right resources. And so here we're talking about authorization and access control. So once I know who you are, what is it that you're supposed to be able to do in my application? And so I want to make sure that the features that are appropriate for you to access are available to you, but probably just as important or more, make sure that you do not have access to things that you're not supposed to have access to. So that's where you're eliminating the risk. And then finally, we talk about the right time. And now here, I'm gonna say that in cybersecurity, IAM is a little bit unique in that it's less about tools and technologies and much more about people and processes. I'd say probably more than half of IAM is making sure that your processes, and I'm talking here about business processes, are running the way that they're supposed to be, that they're well designed. And so if you have those processes running well, then you're going to be able to make sure that when somebody joins your organization, they're given access to the systems that they need to be productive quickly. They're not sitting around being unproductive for days waiting for access to be provisioned. And then more importantly, when they leave the organization, you're able to remove or revoke that access. Because again, there we get into risk. And so, when we think about why is IAM so important to security, you can think about cybersecurity as a whole, I would argue is really about making sure that we protect the assets, the intellectual and informational assets of an organization from the wrong people. And what I just described to you with IAM, that really is the field of IAM. So maybe I won't make a lot of friends at cybersecurity parties, but I would say that all the other cybersecurity domains are really secondary to the core of identity, which is, I believe, at the core of cybersecurity.
That's great. And that really sums up in terms of the importance of the timeliness of the business processes. And it's all about the people, right? In terms of creating those tools. And I think in previous shows as well, we talked about the implementation of our tools, technologies are only as good if it works for the people that it's created for. But,
Absolutely. And if
but
you've
with that,
got bad processes and you automate those processes, now you're just doing bad processes faster.
yeah. Absolutely. That does make me very curious to know in terms of the hats that you play as co-founder and CTO there, Mike. What does a day in your daily, work life really look like?
Well, that's a good question. BlokSec is a software company, so we're building software solutions in the identity and access management space, and it's really a coming of age for me, if that's not too cheesy to say that, because through my career, I graduated from computer science, and then I immediately kind of fell into administrative sort of work, but on the cybersecurity side. This is back in 1999, 2000, when, public websites were not always available for people to log into. So you'd have a public website for your company, but you couldn't really interact with it. And so one of the first things I did was to give people a username and password to log on to sunlife.com. So that's, going way back. Um, but through that experience, I got into consulting. And so I started to help companies enable identity and access management solutions within either their internal businesses, so to support their employee identity and access management, or public facing, so customer identity and access management, CIAM. Um, but I always wanted to get back to that kind of computer science, that software development side. And so for me, BlokSec is really a culmination of not only all of the experiences that myself and my co-founder Caton have had through the years, helping companies build out IAM programs and keep themselves secure, and all the best practices we've picked up along the way, but also all the sort of the secure software development practices that I've learned as well, and we're able to bring all that together. So my day is thinking a lot about where is IAM going in the future. How can BlokSec sort of innovate and work with other companies, and that working with other companies is a very important aspect that we can come back to. And then just as important, it's great if you have this fancy new technology, but if it's not usable by companies that are doing day-to-day business, then there's no value there. So also, how do we bridge that back to the technologies that companies are using today?
Thanks very much, Mike. And that's like a wonderful, background in terms of your career journey. I'm always very curious in terms of, how people got to their positions and what they're doing in their daily roles, right? And it's such an important role that you play. Um, Talking about the IAM industry, of course, it is a hot topic. It's projected to be valued at what is it? I think approximately 25 billion by 2027. Why is identity garnering so much attention, and really, how essential is it to the overall security posture of an organization?
I'll be honest, I think the $25 billion number is very low. I think it's going to be worth a lot more than that. There are some very interesting developments happening in the industry right now, around decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity that we can talk about that a little bit later. But because of that, I think that the influence of IAM is going to expand beyond today. It's there's a lot of focus on enterprise IAM. And I think that we as individuals also need to think that we also have identities and we're using them daily online. And there's not a lot of strategy. People just kind of fall into, well, I log into this, I log into that. They use the same password everywhere because it's too hard to remember different ones. And there's not, it hasn't been well planned for individuals. There's not a lot of support for individuals, but that's changing. And so I think what we consider as IAM today is going to get much larger and be worth a lot more. But to properly answer your question, I should listen to your question and actually answer it. Why is it so central to the organization? I think it's because in an institution, in an organization, there are many different types of identities. We've got employees, which are sort of obvious, but then you've also got probably contractors or contingent workers that are working with your company. You'll have vendors who are coming in providing services. You'll have providers, service providers or suppliers that need to interact with your company. And then, of course, within your company, you're going to have many, many non-person entities or NPEs. And so these would be services that are running, APIs, IoT devices. If you're a manufacturing company, OT type of things that are all working together to actually do business, because a business cannot operate without being able to interface with all of those external and internal parties. And so IAM is an enabler. It's a business enabler that allows those things to interconnect in a way that's secure and minimizes risk to a certain degree. And then I'll also mention that in IAM there are a couple different subdomains that it's probably good to know about. So identity, sort of the identity orchestration, the kind of thing that's maybe obvious. You know, you're getting the information from HR and knowing what to do with that and those processes. And then we'll have access control, which is sort of the gatekeepers at the endpoints to make sure that, you know, the software is going to recognize the credentials this person comes with and says, yes, okay, I know I can let this person in. And that usually is centralized with a sort of a central policy, because otherwise, if you're defining all of this out at every application, it would become ungovernable. And that, of course, leads us to governance. Governance reporting and compliance, or GRC, is this idea of being able to discover at all those endpoints what is the access that everybody has, bring it back to a central place, and then make sure it's appropriate, make sure it complies with regulations, make sure it is appropriate for those people, and then remedy those endpoints and those entitlements if it's necessary. And then lastly, we have privileged access management, or PAM, and that's really talking about the very privileged administrative type accounts that people don't use on a day-to-day basis, but they still need them to do their job. And so we'll want to make sure that we have very tight controls over those, because if those get leaked, it can be very, very damaging to the organization.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a great take in terms of identifying. We talked about the challenges of people protecting their passwords to I am really being an enabler for an organization to us kind of strengthening our governance model, which is pretty much everything in terms of the regulations on that side there. But just touching on this is a question that we commonly get on our show as well there, Mike, is take on password managers or password apps. What's your stance on this?
Absolutely love them. I think they're necessary. So passwords are, what do I say about passwords that's like PG? I have a very strong hatred for passwords, and just that they're so cumbersome, they're so frustrating for users, but they're easy because we've used them for such a long time. Passwords have been around since the 1960s. So when you think about that, we're, you know, more than 60 years old now, when at the time the only input device available to us was a keyboard. And computers today are very different, are much more powerful. And so we can do so much more, but it doesn't change the fact that 95% of the services and applications that we interact with today still require a password. And we know that you cannot use the same password on every site. I had an interesting discussion with my 16-year-old son about this, actually just last week. I was helping him log into something, and he said, "Oh yeah, no, it's don't worry, Dad, I know my password." I said, "Why are you not using, you know, the password manager that I purchased for the family to use?" And he said, "Oh, I just use the same password on every website." I said, "No, No,
And I
man.
hope it's not 123.
No, well, it's a decent password, but
Yeah.
I explained to him that if any one of those websites gets compromised, now that password can be used, basically it gets fed into bots that will then attempt to use it on every other website. And he said, well, no, Dad, I know this website's safe because it's got the little lock. So the lock tells me that this is a secure website and I don't need to worry. And so I think people maybe don't necessarily understand, so I explained to him, of course, that's just SSL. So it means you're talking to a website over an encrypted connection, but it tells you nothing about how that website, how that company manages security on their side. And so if they don't have good security practices, or even if they do, sometimes companies with good security practices have mistakes and things get leaked. And so now your password's out in the wild and all of your websites effectively have been affected. So password managers give us that tool that we as humans, we cannot manage hundreds of passwords. I recently moved from one password manager to another, and when I exported my passwords, I had 1,015. And so imagine trying to remember that many. I can't even remember that many websites, let alone that many passwords. So it's a good memory tool, but I do really hope that it's a sort of going to be a short-lived solution that we'll be able to get rid of soon.
Yeah, password managers is, a way, but is there any other tips that you would advise, or Mike, in terms of for people like your son who is trying to kind of verify if it is a secure website? Is there anything else that he could have done?
Yeah, yeah, there's not much you can do from an end user perspective to really understand how those companies are running security on their side. It's so you're really having to just trust, and that's I think trust and IAM are really strongly connected, because IAM really enables trust, uh, but at the same time you also need to make sure that you're being careful. You can't just trust these websites, and so that's really something that's missing in the internet today. Um, I'm trying to remember his last name, a gentleman from Microsoft famously made the statement that the internet is missing an identity layer. This was 2014, I think, that the statement was made, and I thought that was very interesting. But I thought, yes, missing an identity layer, but really we're missing a trust layer, because having an identity layer is great, but then you still need to understand, is that a trustworthy identity or not? And so that's something that we're really interested in, at BlokSec, is how can we work with those other companies to sort of build that missing layer of trust for the internet? Because really, people cannot be expected to understand all of this stuff, right? I remember reading an article in Tech Republic, and I think I've seen this headline in several places. They say humans are the weakest link in cybersecurity. Have you seen that? Have you heard that term before?
I hear that all the time.
You hear that all the time.
And
I
we do
find
hear that all the time. That's some of the work that we do here at the Center of Excellence as well, is educating folks and talking about, a lot of breaches are due to human error.
right. And how do people respond when you tell them that?
Usually the common response is they're pretty surprised. That it is due to human error. They say, "What do you mean by human error?" But aren't we our target? But it can't possibly be me. So we're drilling down the fact that it's a fair game for cyber criminals out there. That they don't need to target a government organization, or at a large scale that has all the centralized data. Anybody can be a target, really.
Absolutely, absolutely. And although I understand the statement, I'm going to fundamentally disagree with that statement that humans are the weakest link. I think that humans can be the strength, that they can use their brains and they can make intelligent decisions to do the right thing if they're empowered with the right information and the right tools. And so this is where I think we as an industry in IAM need to do a better job. Passwords. That's a perfect example. How can people be expected to remember passwords for everything they interact with? It's not feasible. So how can we simplify things so that an average business person, an average student at school, an average nurse in a hospital they shouldn't have to understand cybersecurity and understand what is trustworthy and what is not. The tools should be in place there to do that in advance so that before they even get to the service to interact with it, it's already been vetted and their identity shared with that service and vice versa. That identity, the identity of that service is shared back to them so that there can be a trusted connection made between those two parties.
That's excellent. And that's an excellent way in terms of, how do we change that from humans being the weakest link to, with the help of education and really spreading awareness about this, that they can be more empowered to also, be responsible and be part of the cybersecurity culture of, where they're at, and just to kind of spread awareness around their circle of friends and family, just like exactly what you're doing in terms of educating your son on a site that he's on.
Yeah, I'm sad that it took until he was 16. I should have done it much earlier. I need to teach a primary class to all my kids.
But thanks for sharing that story there. It's definitely relatable. We do have a lot of students that join in our chats here. But we talked about and confirming that identity is essential to an organization's security posture. We know that IAM touches all areas of an organization, and Mike just shared that with us. Whether it's administrative or executive level, working with information and data that needs to be protected and seen by specific people. But if IAM really touches everything, how does identity reshape security, Mike?
I think that we need to understand that every aspect of security has an element of identity in it. And so from the firewall that's and the intrusion detection systems that are letting traffic into an organization's network to the applications that are running and sending information back and forth between themselves, APIs talking and this concept of microservices, building more complex applications, um, all the way through to the monitoring that happens in the operations center. All of that information moving around through the organization should be on behalf of an identity, a person or a thing. And so we don't have a great way to do that in a lot of cases today. But I think that those things are evolving and improving so that ideally we'll get to a state where any transaction that's any traffic that's flowing over the network will be identifiable and attributable to a person or to a thing that's supposed to be doing that work, that's approved and allowed in that organization. And so through a better understanding of those identities, a better mechanism of tagging that traffic to an identity, I think we can really reshape and improve how intelligent the security controls are in an organization through context. And so it's that identity provides that context of what is that traffic doing, who is it for, and is it supposed to be there? And so this is where we can maybe start to weave AI into the conversation a little bit, in that if you can imagine at an organization of any significant size beyond 50 people, you're starting to have dozens of applications, X number of employees, processes, systems. It becomes an incredible mesh of information. And being able to coordinate and understand what's happening in that mesh it's not a human processable thing in real time. And that's where AI can help, where we can build out these models of what the system is, how it works, and start to wrap controls around it that can be learned by machine through observing behavior and traffic patterns that are existing today, that we tell it business is running well, everything is good, this is normal traffic. And then it can start to look and say, okay, something is not right. This is, for example, this is user behavior. That's another, in access control world, we talk about user behavioral analytics, understanding what is normal for this user, what is not normal. We can start to flag those things in real time. So rather than a breach happened and we go back and we look through logs and we say, oh, you know what, here's somebody accessing this during off hours that they don't normally access from a location they don't normally come from, we can flag that in real time and we can stop it before it happens. So you become more preventative as opposed to reactive.
Yeah, it's a very interesting take in terms of the capabilities that we have now in terms of observing technologies and the kind of the user behaviors that we see. But in terms of, I just want to dig a little bit deeper in terms of the IAM structure there, Mike. In terms of the IAM industry is it governed by particular standards and protocols, or does each vendor really pursue their own frameworks within this industry?
When you say protocols, I assume you're not referring to like technical protocols, right? Like how information is transferred, but rather you're talking about like regulatory stuff.
That's right, the regulatory
Okay.
governance of protocols in that aspect.
Okay, good. I'm glad I clarified because if we got into the technical protocols, it'd be like alphabet soup. I'd be pulling out all the acronyms. Um,
We'd be
the,
having a second segment bringing you back on.
yeah, exactly. That I could talk about that for quite some time. There are not strict protocols or there are sort of, I would say there are more like methodologies, but it's traditionally with IAM because every company is very unique and there are so many flavors and so many vendors that get cobbled together in different ways. I don't know that in the past it's been possible to put together a really strong framework, or at least it hasn't been done successfully to my knowledge and experience. I have worked with a couple of sort of information risk assessment tools, like ISF has one, but I'm not a big fan of it because it ends up being a little more generalized. It's more of like a general cybersecurity framework or assessment tool, as opposed to being specific for IAM. So that's sort of in the past, right? And so those would sort of help organizations to assess, and then typically you'd have somebody like me come in. Like that's one of the things I used to do as a consultant is I would go into an organization and we'd perform an assessment. And so the assessment would be, what are the processes that you have running today? Where does the data come from? What's working well? What's not working well? And it's also a lot of work. It requires input from so many people in the organization because, of course, IAM is touches every part of the organization. So we need people from HR, we need people from security, risk management, from operations, from management. Um, and so that's always been up to the consultant, up to the consulting company. The Big Four are great at doing this type of stuff as well. To come in, do that assessment, and then provide recommendations, what can be improved. And then usually they'll come with a roadmap as well. Here's sort of to get to a good state. Here, it's not something you can just slap in a tool and turn it on and it's gonna fix things. IAM really needs to be thought of as a program, not a project. And it's a multi-year thing and probably needs to continue running even after things get to sort of the goal state. You probably still need to keep refreshing. But coming back to, I mentioned that's sort of like the old way. We do see NIST coming out with a new framework now. There's a NIST special document, special protocol. 800-63 is the number of it. And I read through it recently, and it's great. It's still a bit high level, and so you still need to read it and understand and think about what are the risks that they're identifying, what are the controls that they're looking for, and then how do we actually put those into practice from a pragmatic standpoint. So I think that's an emerging framework that we'll see if that comes up and works to success for organizations. I'm just thinking about any other frameworks I've worked with. Um, I'd say if I were to put my hat on as the assessor, I would say that thinking about the processes is very important. Making sure the people are bought into the work of helping to correct the processes and roll out the new strategy as it becomes developed. And then I would say for your strategy, understand that there's no one tool that's going to do everything in IAM. There's not like hey, go buy this vendor and implement their tool, and then your IAM problems will be solved, right? You need multiple different technologies, different layers of the organization. And so think also in advance about how will those tools work together, because you need that interoperability to have a successful IAM implementation.
That's right. And in terms of, we talked about it being critical to organizations in terms of implementing their framework, and thanks very much, Mike. But in your role and the many hats that you play here, how would you go about developing an identity and access management strategy if you had to, advise an organization, for instance?
Yeah, it's really it's organization by organization. There are those core. So I talked about the 5 rights at the beginning, right? So thinking about breaking it down to identity and how that identity is orchestrated. That's sort of your fundamental building block of your IAM program. So the strategy needs to be to get that to a state that is clean, and that's not easy. So there's some data governance in there as well, because that identity information comes into the organization typically from HR. You need to make sure that you're getting the right information to set up the IT or the IS type of uh, representation of that user, and then you're going to want to be able to flow that to all the downstream systems. And so that orchestration of information is number one. Number two, I think from a strategic perspective, you need to think about not just your employees. I think a lot of companies will sort of put blinders on and say, okay, we want to take care of identity for our employees, and there's so much more than that, right? So you need to take into account those other identity types that I mentioned at the beginning, and the trickiest ones to deal with are the privileged identities. So like those type of administrative accounts. There's another type, which are generic or shared accounts, which are frequently very difficult to deal with because there's not a single person that you can tag with owning that account. And then the machine identities, so the service accounts. So I would say number two, so identity orchestration, number one. Number two, make sure that you're considering all those identity types in your organization. And then number three, I think probably the best cybersecurity advice that I could give to a company from an IAM perspective would be to look at how you can consolidate, unify, and centralize your identities. Any company that's old enough to be a teenager, I guarantee will have multiple identity sources. And so it makes it impossible or very difficult and expensive to govern. And it makes it much more likely that you're going to have incorrect access or access that's not terminated when a person leaves the organization. So the more you can move towards a single source of truth for identity, the better positioned you will be to then roll out the access of those identities to the rest of the organization. And then I guess the last 2 parts of the strategy would be one is what can the identities do? So now we're talking about access control and making sure that, again, coming back to that concept of unification, centralization, try to have a single mechanism for authentication for people so that, this is the concept of SSO. You sign in once, and then you're able to bring that session or that authentication with you to different applications. So you're proving once who you are, and we can make that as painful as it needs to be. You might have to, use an authenticator app on your phone, or even if it's really secure, you might have a hardware token of some type, or even better, you use BlokSec because it's much friendlier for users. Sorry, a little plug there. And then you get that super strong authentication. We know who that person is, and you only do that once. And then now you're able to access all the applications that you need to. So users are not feeling frustrated.
Yep.
But from a security standpoint, you're keeping them secure. And if while you're doing that, if you can move away from passwords, even if it's just step by step, take those baby steps, you're going to start to also drive down your cost of operating that system and the cost of your help desk responding to password change requests. We worked with an organization recently that told us that 75% of the calls to the help desk are for password resets still in 2023. And so think of there's a big return on investment there if we can start to draw that down a little bit and allow those help desk people to start doing things that is more productive and more fruitful for the business. And then, sorry, and I said there was one more thing. Sorry, I told you I was going to go on these long monologues, and feel free to cut me off. But the last one is, of course, the governance reporting and compliance. So it's great to have, all of that stuff is running nicely, but it's the kind of thing where the moment you set it, it gets stale. And I've seen this so many times. You can have the greatest program, but organizations are not static. Organizations change all the time, and identity programs need to move with the organization. And so that's where the GRC side of things can keep tabs on what's going on, make sure it's understood who has access to what, and make sure that the people who are responsible for individuals, so the managers or the owners of those systems, the people who are the right people to decide if that's correct or not, are able to see it, approve it, or revoke it if it's appropriate. And so you go from that foundation up through, orchestration, data, make sure you're covering all your bases, all your identities are covered, make sure you get a single source of truth for all of that information, and then have it securely used to log into things so that people are able to access what they need from a business perspective, and then govern it all with the right tools to make sure that it's appropriate. And in almost every layer of that strategy that I talked about, AI can help to make things more efficient, make things work with less human intervention required, and make things happen faster.
Yeah, it's all about, the users and AI. And as we want to just shift the conversation now, Mike, in terms of AI and trust. In a recent survey that I saw, IBM had shared out a survey, I think, of approximately 7,500 businesses around the world about their opinions on AI. And I'm just going to read here in terms of what the author states, quote, "A significant challenge is that the field of applied AI ethics is still relatively new, and most companies cite a lack of skills and training." So we see that there's definitely those key challenges that we discussed today to ensure greater trust in AI. That includes the lack of skills or perhaps training that needs to be further honed or developed and manage trustworthy AI. But that AI, we talked about governance and management tools. They don't work across all environments, and sometimes AI outcomes can be unexplainable. But as you can see, there's still a lack of trust as it comes to AI and managing information. But when it comes to centralizing to IAM and trust, does AI really compromise that trust at all? And can users really feel safe about how their work is being monitored?
That's a really great question, and you brought up some good points there. I love that quote from the person at IBM. I think yeah. So AI and IAM need to work together. And you mentioned trust, right? So trust being central to IAM. I would flip that around and say IAM is central to trust. You need to be able to know who users are in order to trust them. If you don't know who they are, then you've not established a basis for trust to begin with. And so I'd say IAM is probably a key enabler in that trusting relationship. And I think that AI can help with that because it's going to allow us, like I talked about earlier, as our systems become more complex, it's able to help us make those relationships in real time and build that context. But yes, you brought up a great point. It's hard to trust AI. And anybody who has had some conversations with ChatGPT in the last couple of months can tell you that AI is not always right. It can come to not necessarily correct conclusions, and also can be biased and can even be discriminatory based on how the AI was built. So I'm thinking about a story of, speaking of IBM, I know that they were sued. I think it was in 2020. They were sued by their employees because they had implemented an AI-based performance evaluation tool, and it was proven to be biased and gave lower performance reviews to older workers. And so that's one example. I can think of a couple others. Amazon had a problem with that as well. They were trying to use AI as part of their hiring process, and it was giving lower scores to female candidates because the data it had been used, the data it had been trained on, were the previous Amazon employees who were predominantly men, and so it was seeing, the words and language that men use in their resume was scoring higher than the words and language that the women were using, and so they were disqualifying or favoring less the female candidates for those jobs. So they had to pull that out. So this comes back to the skill gap that you talked about. I think that we're still learning how to build these tools appropriately. And I think that we need to make sure that we have transparency and oversight in AI. Those are going to be two really key things that are necessary to govern and make sure that AI is doing what we want it to do and just doesn't run away with doing the wrong thing faster, like I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you mentioned monitoring too, right? Like, can we trust how we're being monitored? I would say if you're worried about monitoring, I have bad news for you. We've been monitored for years. Everything, as a cybersecurity expert, I'm not a network guy. I'm not a firewall guy, but I know enough that all of the traffic that goes through the corporate network, including what you're browsing, if you're connected to VPN and you're from home, browsing the web on your company laptop, even if you're not connected to VPN in some cases with endpoint agents that are running on your machine, that information can be collected, can be monitored. And so what AI is doing there is AI is not really the problem. AI is just making that type of monitoring more efficient. And so, more patterns. AI is really building giant graphs. I want to demystify AI a little bit. And maybe I can do I have time to tell a quick story?
Of course you do. Yeah. Yeah, this is all very interesting. We're just
Okay.
all taking in this information.
As a computer science student at the University of Toronto in 1998 or 1999, one of the courses I got to take was AI. And I was so excited. AI, this is going to be like, I'm finally going to learn something so cool about computer science. I was a big Star Trek fan, so I was thinking, I'll be learning how to build computers that can talk back and answer my questions. And I was so disappointed to learn, as I went through the class, it was, we're learning how to solve the traveling salesman problem. How do I find the most efficient way for somebody to traverse a graph with various costs? And it was not at all what I expected. And so, just bringing it back to demystifying AI a little bit, it's not an intelligence, it's not a consciousness. It's really a massive amount of data with some rules applied to it, some math applied to it, and a lot of computational power that lets us find patterns and make decisions based on those patterns. ChatGPT is literally picking the next word in the sentence based on its massive graph of information. It's not thinking about rationalizing its answers that it's providing back to you. So so AI is not like inherently an evil thing or a conscious thing. It's just it needs to be programmed and managed properly. And I know you're with the government, so it's important also that our governments are doing the right thing with this technology as well. So we talk about monitoring within the context of an organization. I am personally much more concerned about monitoring in the context of as being a citizen of the country. And we can look at some examples like the sort of the worst case dystopia example being China, right? And how, with the cameras that they have around and the facial recognition, the social credit score that they've implemented, and essentially the censorship at a massive scale, these things that they're doing to sort of quell dissent and keep control over the populace is all powered by AI. And so that's an example of, if AI is not used for good purposes, it can be very powerful and not in a good way for us as people. So I'm very interested in making sure that AI is used in a way that's responsibly, that maintains privacy for people. That's another important aspect to consider. And I just hope that companies will use this new tool and this new technology with good ethics.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting take in terms of the case studies that you've shared in terms to justify the lack of trust that people might have towards AI. But it really brings back to, how do we continue to shift things to make sure that this is a program that's always changing, that's ever improving with great oversight to continue to build that trust. But then I also hear there's a number of people who is either a fan of AI or they find that it's a creepiness level of creepiness factor, I should say, of AI monitoring us and everything that that we're currently doing. But an important point, and yes, in terms of work here, the work that we do at the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, we're working closely with broader public sector organizations here, Mike. So that includes hospitals, education, higher ed to K to 12, social services, transportation alike. But how would you see the use of AI really getting implemented to perhaps like various sector specific? And is there any insight that you can share with us in terms of what innovations you're probably working towards around IAM?
Sure, yeah. Well, I should maybe start by stating that I'm not an expert in AI. So I'm more of an enthusiast, and looking at it from the lens of, identity and access management. But so I've been thinking a lot about AI and identity in particular. And so the things that you just talked about, working with hospitals, working with education, those I think are sectors where AI has the potential to bring a lot of benefit. So in healthcare, there's too much data. There's too much data in disparate locations. And I know there's a lot of work being done to bring that together. And so I think once we have a more holistic set of data about a person, assuming that we're going to do all the right things to keep the privacy and security of that data strong, AI can then start to be used to looking for those patterns. And we might be able to start having a bit of preventative medicine, where we're able to predict, illnesses before they occur, or find patterns. Myself, 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with leukemia, and I went through a stem cell transplant and had to take care of that. But leukemia is one of those illnesses where there's not today an explanation for why people get it. But there were several people in my neighborhood. It's very strange. Down the street from me, another gentleman, same age as me, same type of leukemia at the same time. And we have no way to do any type of work to correlate those events. So that's something that has to be done at the government level, at the healthcare system level. And maybe we'll be able to discover perhaps patterns that will point to a cause that will, in the future, maybe be able to prevent this type of, if it's a preventable thing, maybe we can discover something new about it through the power of AI. Education, again, understanding in a better way how students learn, when is the right time for them to learn, what information is best brought to them, and optimize to improve education and be as efficient as possible with that. And I can think of also urban planning would probably be another great sector for AI. If we understand populations and how they move and how they work, we can better optimize the urban resources that are available to those people. So again, just sort of the ideas that I had thought about when it comes to identity. Identity is a part of all of those things. We're wanting to tie that back to the person and what they're doing in their environment, and then how can we sort of work as a society to make things better for those people. And then I guess you asked about our innovations. So this is the stuff I'm most excited to talk about. I guess passwordless authentication is one of the things that you mentioned in the intro. And so for passwordless authentication, if we go back to, we talked at the very beginning in the 5 rights as to how do we identify that a person is who they say they are, and figuring out who the dog behind the monitor is. It's not easy to do, and we've done it today usually with passwords. And then we've started to layer on what I would call kind of band-aids to make passwords better. So the idea of multi-factor authentication, you're still using a password to identify yourself, and then you're adding an additional factor with the possession factor. I possess this phone that gets the SMS token, or I possess the authenticator or the RSA key. So that makes it better, but you've still got that foundation of the password. Then we've got user behavioral analytics, and that's where AI comes in, and we're starting to look for patterns. But again, you're still making a better educated guess about who the person is based on that foundation of the password. And so what we've done at BlokSec is we've taken inspiration from the way blockchains like Ethereum and Bitcoin authenticate transactions, and they're using cryptographic credentials. And so in any of these types of conversations, there's a private key and a public key. And these two parts of the cryptographic credentials can be used to verify any transaction. So I can use my private key to sign something, and then the public key on the other end can prove mathematically that the signature came from my private key. And this technology is not new. This has been around for probably 20 years. What's new is that we have these things in our pockets, all of us, and they're very, very good at, number one, making sure that it's us who's holding them by AI, taking a picture of our face, right? That facial recognition is AI. We don't think about it, but it is. And they've got very good security built into the hardware of the device, so that I can put that private key in a place that even the rest of the software in my device cannot access it. And so we've got that technology to secure things on the user's end. And then on the server side, where the public key resides, we have blockchain technology, something that's come about in the last few years. And so it's very important on the other side, where the public key resides, that we make sure that cannot be tampered with. Because even if you've got all this security on your mobile device and you're able to biometrically prove that it's you who's holding the phone, if on the other end somebody can get into that database and change out the public key, you can now take over my account. Even though you don't have my phone, you don't have my private key. Blockchains give us that pardon the pun, the missing link to enable us to make sure that that's an immutable piece of information about me. Nobody can change it once I've written it. And so now I can prove that I am who I say I am through the use of my phone by signing a message, sending it back, and I can mathematically prove that it came from me on the other side. And then from a user's perspective, it's just as easy as pulling out your phone, Face ID sees it's you, you say, yes, I'm trying to log in, and it's done. So we've built the system, and then I guess now what we're working on is how do we make this as easy as possible for companies to implement? Because I did mention that Caton and I both have these many years of consulting, helping companies implement identity and access management tools. And we understand that at any large company, there are so many different technologies at play that probably the biggest cost and effort in any IAM project is bringing all those things together, bringing all those systems together and having them interoperate. And so we're trying to figure out, and we're making inroads on, how do we bridge the gap between this new technology, this sort of passwordless, strong authentication, and these, hundreds, sometimes thousands. Like we've been at companies where they have 5,000 plus applications running inside their environment that all need their own way of being able to identify the user. So how can we take this technology and deploy it at scale in applications that maybe were written 20 years ago without without thinking about how do we accommodate for those future requirements.
Fantastic. And I do see a lot of questions coming through from our viewers today there, Mike. We'll get to it very shortly. There's one that's related to what you discussed in terms of the innovative services that BlokSec is rolling out. In terms of, is there anything else that you'd like to expand in terms of how BlokSec is incorporating AI into all of your products? This user here is asking, is it built as an add-on or an essential component of the service orchestration? And I'll get to the other questions after, but this one was related to what we're discussing here today.
Yeah, that's a great question. So AI is not built into the fabric of our product at this time. Really, I think the primary goal of our sort of we're actually on V3 now of the product, but this sort of early and foundational iteration of our product was about making sure that we've got the security in place that's required to be a strong identifier of the user and what they should be able to access. I believe that if you do that right, there's no need for AI. You don't need to. AI is again, we're looking for patterns. We're looking to build rules around those patterns and try to make more informed decisions. If you've got something that's a mathematically provable identity, you don't require that type of fuzziness that AI can bring to that equation. So it's not something that we're using today. However, we are also, I know we've only got so much time, but as we look to the future and we're looking at building decentralized identity and self-sovereign identity, this is sort of the building blocks of BlokSec are there to enable us to move to that next sort of broader vision of how identity can be rolled out, not just in organizations, but as across Canada, across other sectors. AI will definitely play a role there because it's going to grow in complexity, and we're going to need that additional ability to make those connections.
Fantastic.
That's like its whole own show.
That's the next phase, right?
Yeah.
We'll definitely have to bring you back to discuss more of that when we're ready here. But I do have one last question for you before we get into more of the questions here, just based on time. And this is a question that I asked to all my guests. One of our favorite questions is, what is the best cybersecurity advice you can give or have ever received, Mike?
That's easy. Don't use the same password on multiple sites, please. It's so easy and nobody does it, right? Get a password manager if you need it. It's built into your browser. Pay for one. Use your phone. Even, I don't care, make a spreadsheet. Just don't use the same password on every website, please. There's so many tools out there that exploit that. Whatever site you've used that password on will be compromised immediately.
Fantastic. Yeah, that is actually definitely one of the tips that we roll out here, probably like once a day at the very least. I'm sharing that out. All right, let's move now on to our Q&A. Our viewers have been patiently waiting. Our first question here from one of our viewers is, I'm curious to know, does Mike think that AI can reduce human errors in IAM? I think we touched on this a bit, but Mike, is there anything else you'd like to kind of expand on?
Yes, absolutely. That's actually a great application of AI in IAM. We think about GRC alone. This applies everywhere, but me as a person at a company, I can have easily 500 entitlements. And so, especially if you've got SAP, like let's talk about SAP separately. That alone has hundreds of different permissions. So depending on the granularity of the permissions in the applications that I'm accessing, it can get super complex. Now put that in front of a business manager. So I'm an IT person. I probably understand what a lot of those things are, but IT is a very small part of the organization that the rest of the company that actually does stuff, that brings money into the company, that actually does business, they're not going to understand this SAP role, XRT 300-1. Like they don't know what the heck that is. So AI can do a very good job here of comparing the access that I have, the access my peers have, other people in my role, other people with my title, other people at my level, other people in my building. It can start to build this sort of fabric of patterns and pick out anomalies. And so now, from those 500 entitlements that I had, if I can narrow that down to 10 that are look a little bit different and have my manager just look over those 10 entitlements, now we've really made a big difference in terms of the quality of the attention they're going to be able to give to those things. And of course, reduce that human error because they're not just going, oh, I don't know. Yes, fine, go. Which is what we see a lot of today.
Fantastic. All right, moving on to our next question. How do you train your AI models and create baselines?
I'm gonna have to pass on this question because I'm not an expert in AI. I understand that those things need to happen, but it's not within the realm of my expertise. So I'm very sorry to the person who asked that question. Maybe another AI expert guest can answer that one.
Not to worry, we'll circle back on that. Just wondering, what can I do in my personal life to keep my identity and information safe?
That's a great question. Okay, so think about where you're sharing information and how much information you're sharing. I'm assuming here we're talking about privacy. Um, I guess privacy may only be one aspect of that question. My mind immediately goes to privacy, um, but of course there are multiple aspects of your identity. There's your relationships with other people. There's the information about you, your attributes, and so being being I guess careful about how you share that information with whom. So if you're using social media, be aware that that is essentially public information, no matter how you set your privacy controls on Facebook and Instagram and all the rest. Once it's out there, it's consider it public. And then I guess number two is make sure that you are uh, judiciously using good access control around how you log into things. So don't use weak passwords. Here's a good tip that I can share with the person who asked that question. If you use Gmail, Gmail has the feature that you can add the plus symbol and then anything you want after the first part of the email address. So I'm mike.gillan@gmail.com. I can do mike.gillan plus this service I'm signing up for at gmail.com. So I routinely do that. And then what I can do then is if I start to see emails, spam, people contacting me from that email address that has the service name in it, I know exactly who leaked my personal information there. So that's more of a reactive thing, I guess. It's you're going to be able to see after the fact what happened, but then you'll know where not to continue to place your trust.
Right. I think we've got time for just one more question here, there, Mike. So, how do you propose we account for anomalies in our AI models?
Yeah, that's again getting a little deep on the AI side. I do know from the work that I've done with another company here in Burlington that builds a GRC product that uses AI, Innate Identity. Shout out for those guys who are doing great work. Um, there is an element of oversight and transparency that needs to be there. To account for anomalies, you don't always have transparency. You cannot always see the data that's training the AI, nor are you able to go down into that data model. Probably none of us are smart enough to understand it anyway. So the most important thing there is that oversight. If you're going to start using AI to automate a process, don't just turn it on and let it go. Turn it on and let it recommend as opposed to make decisions. And look at the recommendations it makes and help it to understand, yes, this was a good, ideally your AI product is going to be something that can learn. And you can say, yes, yes, no, don't do that. And so then we can make sure that we're training the correct behavior. And even when you do turn on that fully automated, if you ever do, continue to watch it. Don't just let it go, because as we've seen from all the examples we talked about earlier in the show, AI can make wrong decisions, and so we need to be sure that we're monitoring it. It's not perfect. It's certainly not perfect today. Hopefully, it'll be better in the future. But until we get to that perfect AI state, which who knows if we'll get there, it still needs that human to make sure the human element is there.
Fantastic, Mike. Lots to take note as you're speaking today and to learn all about AI. We did have a goal in place that we talked about at the beginning of the show, is that at the end of this episode, you'll be going away of a greater understanding of how AI is shaping the future of access management and identifying some of the challenges. And even Mike even shared with us the roadmap of developing kind of your strategy on that side there. So this does conclude our Cyber Talk session. Thanks very much, Mike, for taking your time and sharing all of your advice, especially around how you're talking about program. I am treated as a program, not as a project. By having the greatest program, making sure that it's not static and it's keeping up with how things are changing and how things are improving. So it needs to be a constant change, and that we need to build trust in IAM as it's going to become an enabler for us and our organization, and really making sure that IAM is central to trust to work for our organization. So considering your identity types, looking at how you can centralize your identity, moving to a single source of truth, to understanding identities management, what they can do to ensure unification, for it to be a single mechanism for authentication for people, for our governance and a compliance structure. So lots of insight. Hopefully I
Nicely
summed up kind of a
summarized.
bit of it.
Yeah. Well, I hope
But
people have found this useful. I
yeah,
want to thank siberX for hosting the show, and to all the people who have stuck with us through the conversation and my monologuing. I appreciate and hope that it was a good use of your time. And Julia, I really enjoyed our conversation today. So thank you.
same here. And if you did think that we reached our goals today, thumbs up in the comment section. But do feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section as well. But as always, at this time, it's important to stay on top of cybersecurity best practices to keep yourself and those around cyber safe. So I do encourage everyone to keep coming back and learning about cybersecurity with us on Cyber Talk Show with me, Julia Lee, and stay cyber safe, and see you soon, guys.